It begins with a brass valve, not the kind you find in a modern hardware store, nor the industrial cast iron of the Victorian era. This is something else. It is tucked behind a rotting drywall in a condemned tenement in the Lower East Side, a piece of plumbing that connects to nothing. It is heavy, impossibly dense, etched with a geometric precision that defies the hand-cranked lathes of the 19th century. I found it while trailing a lead on the city's forgotten steam tunnels, and it felt cold, colder than the damp basement air. When you hold it, you don't just feel the weight of metal, you feel the weight of a lie. Ask yourself why a residential building from 1892 would require a pressure regulator designed for atmospheric energies we claim not to have understood until decades later. Ask yourself why the blueprints for this specific block were lost in a convenient fire in 1911. We are told that history is a straight line, a steady climb from the mud to the stars. But the deeper I go into these foundations, the more that line begins to look like a circle, or perhaps a shroud. I spent weeks tracing the metallurgical composition of this single valve, and the results were an impossibility. It contains an alloy of iridium and copper that shouldn't have been stable under the smelting techniques of the Gilded Age. It suggests a mastery of load distribution that bypasses our known physics. It suggests that the men who built this city weren't just masons and architects. They were something else. They were inheritors, not creators, not innovators, inheritors of a defunct global grid. You see it in the windows of the older world. Walk through any major city, San Francisco, Chicago, Moscow, Melbourne, and look at the ground floor. Or rather, look at what used to be the ground floor. Half-buried arches, windows that peek out from the sidewalk like eyes drowning in the earth. The official narrative calls them light wells. They tell us it was a fashion, choice, or a way to bring sunlight into basement kitchens. But why would an entire generation of architects across every continent simultaneously decide to build their grandest structures 6 feet into the mud? Why would they waste the labour? Why would they compromise the foundations? What if the mud wasn't a choice? What if the mud was the event? We are taught about the great fires, the great resets of the mid-1800s. We are told these cities burned because they were made of wood, yet the photographs of the ruins show scorched stone and melted steel, remnants of a heat that no timber fire could ever generate. Look at the ruins of Chicago in 1871. Look at the jagged, crystalline remains of buildings that were supposedly only a few years old. They look like ancient monuments, not recent constructions. The engineers of this era didn't build these cities. They excavated them, they found them, they reclaimed them, and then they began the process of institutional erasure. They didn't just hide the technology. They rewrote the very reason for our existence. They turned the high-energy cathedrals of a lost empire into houses of worship and government offices. They stripped the gilded domes of their resonators. They cut the wires. They silenced the frequency. Think about the sheer scale of the world's fairs. Between 1850 and 1915, massive, ornate white cities were constructed across the globe. These were gargantuan complexes of marble, glass and steel, sprawling over hundreds of acres, built with a level of architectural sophistication that we struggle to replicate today with modern cranes and computer-aided design. And yet, we are told they were temporary. We are told they were built in less than 2 years by labourers using horse-drawn carriages. We are told they were intended to be demolished as soon as the fair ended. Ask yourself, who builds a palace just to tear it down? Who spends the equivalent of billions of dollars on a temporary structure featuring functioning electric lighting, advanced sewage systems, and massive lagoons, not a rational society, not a developing one. It only makes sense if those cities were already there. It only makes sense if the fairs were not exhibitions of progress, but liquidation sales of a fallen civilization. They were the staging grounds for the final transition. They brought the public in to marvel at the new inventions, the light bulb, the radio, the telephone, to convince them that these technologies were being birthed in that very moment. But what if they were just being declassified? What if the fairs were a psychological operation designed to reset the collective memory? They gave us the light bulb so we wouldn't ask about the wireless atmospheric energy that once powered the entire skyline. They gave us the coal-fired engine so we wouldn't look for the mercury vortex drives that had been scrubbed from the history books. The trail doesn't end at the demolition of the fairs. It leads into the shadows of the elite universities and the nascent patent offices. This is where the engineers went, not into retirement, not into the grave. They were folded into the new structure. After the mud flood, after the Great Reset of the mid-19th century, there was a surplus of high-functioning technology that couldn't be explained away. A new class of gatekeepers was required. I've spent months scouring the personnel records of early industrial conglomerates. You see the same names appearing, then vanishing. A brilliant hydro engineer in Berlin disappears in 1874, only to have his signature appear on a series of anonymous patents for signal amplification in New York 5 years later. They were being gathered. They were being siloed. The engineers of the Tartarian era, the ones who understood how to pull power from the ether, how to use frequency to heal the body, how to move stone with sound, they were given a choice: work for the new masters or be erased along with their work. Most chose to work. They became the architects of the hidden world. They designed the bunkers. They laid the foundations for the deep underground military bases that mirror the ancient star forts. They turned the technology of liberation into the technology of control, not for us, not for the public, for the preservation of the hierarchy. We must look at the star forts. These geometric marvels are scattered across every continent, from the coast of Florida to the plains of Russia, from the islands of Japan to the tip of South Africa. We are told they are defensive fortifications built to withstand cannon fire. But look at the geometry. Look at the fractal patterns. These aren't just walls, they are circuits. They are massive earthen resonators. If you overlay the floor plan of a star fort with a modern motherboard, the similarities are not just coincidental, they are functional. The load distribution, the crystalline structure of the stone, the proximity to water, it all points to a purpose far beyond warfare. They were nodes in a global power grid. They were the batteries of the old world, but after the reset, their functions were obscured. They were filled with dirt. They were renamed. Some were turned into prisons, others into psychiatric hospitals. What better way to hide the truth than to house those who have lost their minds within the very machines that once powered the human spirit? Institutional gatekeeping isn't just about what is taught in schools. It's about how the physical world is repurposed to reinforce the lie. Every time you walk past a historic fort, you are walking past a piece of suppressed hardware. The erasure is most evident in the maps. Compare a map of the world from 1650 to one from 1850. In the earlier maps, a massive region is labelled Tartaria. It spans from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, covering the vast majority of northern Asia. It has its own flag, its own emperors, its own distinct architectural style. Then, almost overnight, it vanishes. It is carved up into Russia, Mongolia, and China. The history books tell us it was merely a geographic term used by Europeans who didn't know any better. But You don't build a Great Wall, which, if you look at the crenellations, was designed to defend against the south, not the north, to protect against a geographic term. You don't build thousands of miles of unified rail and telegraph lines across a void. Tartaria was the centre of the old world's energy grid. It was the source of the engineers who understood the resonance of the earth. When the reset came, whether through a weaponized cataclysm or a natural disaster that was capitalized upon, Tartaria was the primary target for erasure. Their history was burnt. Their libraries were looted. Their language was forbidden. What we call the Enlightenment was actually the period of darkness where the remnants of Tartaria were systematically dismantled and their technology was claimed by the rising powers of the West. Not a discovery, not a rebirth, a conquest of memory. I found a diary in an estate sale in Vermont belonging to a man who worked as a surveyor for the railroad in the 1880s. He writes of finding cities beneath the plains. He describes uncovering perfectly paved streets and stone buildings while digging for the transcontinental tracks. He writes of being ordered by his superiors to fill them back in, to say nothing, to treat the discovery as if it were merely a strange rock formation. This is the institutional erasure in its rawest form. The engineers who stayed on the surface were tasked with building a new world on top of the old one, using the old one as a foundation. They were told it was for the sake of order, for the sake of progress, but the staccato rhythm of their work, the frantic speed at which they developed the American West, suggests a deadline. They were racing to cover the tracks before the new generations could ask questions. They were building a veneer, a thin layer of brick and mortar to hide the monolithic stone beneath. Not this history, not that history, something else entirely, a history of silence. If the technology was so advanced, why did it fail? This is the question that keeps me awake. If they had free energy, if they had the star forts, if they had the engineers who could manipulate the very fabric of reality, how did they lose? Perhaps they didn't lose in a war. Perhaps they were victims of their own success. Or perhaps the reset wasn't an attack from outside, but a failure from within. A systemic collapse of the frequency. Or maybe the gatekeepers we see today are the same ones who have always been there. Maybe the engineers didn't go anywhere. Maybe they just changed their names. They went from the builders of cathedrals to the founders of Silicon Valley. They went from the masters of ether to the masters of the algorithm. The knowledge hasn't been lost. It has been concentrated. It has been taken out of the public square and placed into the hands of a technocratic elite who use it to manage the cattle. Ask yourself, if you had the power to provide free energy to every human on earth, would you? Or would you realize that free energy means free people? And free people are impossible to rule. The engineers of the reset chose rule. They chose the shadow. As I look at the brass valve again, sitting on my desk, I realize it isn't a relic of a dead past. It's a reminder of a suppressed present. The energy it was meant to regulate is still there, humming beneath the pavement, vibrating in the stones of the old cathedrals. The institutional erasure is failing. The mud is drying up. People are beginning to notice the buried windows. They are beginning to notice the impossible geometry of the star forts. They are beginning to ask why their history feels like a fever dream. We are living in the ruins of a giant's workshop, playing with the scraps he left behind. The engineers who went into hiding left a trail, not of breadcrumbs, but of anomalies. Every out-of-place artifact, every impossible building, every lost civilization is a crack in the dam, and the water is starting to seep through. What happens when the dam breaks? What happens when we realize that the dark, somber world we've been told is our only reality is just a cage built from the bones of a golden age? What if the reset is not a singular event in the past, but a recurring process? What if we are approaching another one? The signs are there, the narrowing of discourse, the destruction of physical archives in favour of digital ones that can be altered with a keystroke, the frantic push to move humanity into a synthetic reality. It feels like the engineers are preparing for another liquidation. They are cleaning the slate again. They are ready to bury our ground floors and tell the survivors that we were just primitive ancestors who didn't know any better. They will find our microchips and call them jewelry. They will find our skyscrapers and call them monuments to ancient gods. And the cycle will begin again. Not progress, not evolution, just a sequence of controlled collapses. Unless we stop looking at the valve and start looking at the hand that turned it, unless we stop being the subjects of the investigation and start being the investigators, the evidence is all around us. It is in the stone. It is in the sky. It is in the silence of the history books. Ask yourself, what are you standing on? What is beneath the mud? What is the frequency of the truth? The survey markers of the 19th century do not align with the topography of the 19th century. I have spent months overlaying colonial-era maps with modern LiDAR scans of the American Midwest and the Siberian tundra. The discrepancies are not errors of instrumentation. They are systematic. They represent a deliberate recalibration of the Earth's surface. Not this mountain, not that river. Something else entirely. The engineers who emerged from the mid-century resets were tasked with a cartographic cleansing. They were redefining the boundaries of the possible. They were erasing the ley lines and the resonance nodes that the Tartarian builders had mapped with crystalline precision. Ask yourself why every state capital in the United States, built in a supposed frontier wilderness, features a massive copper-clad dome and subterranean galleries that predate the surrounding timber shacks. Ask yourself how pioneer masons, with no local quarries and limited transportation, could haul thousands of tons of granite to build a Greco-Roman palace in the middle of a swamp. They didn't haul it. They uncovered it. They cleared the silt from the facades and claimed the glory for a new republic. The institutional gatekeeping of the Smithsonian and the Royal Geographical Society was established specifically to manage these discoveries. They created the narrative of the neoclassical revival to explain away a global infrastructure that they were too small to understand and too greedy to share. Consider the transatlantic telegraph cables. We are taught that Cyrus Field and his team laid thousands of miles of copper wire across the jagged, mountainous floor of the Atlantic in 1858 using primitive steamships. It is a story of heroic perseverance against impossible odds. But look at the technical specifications of those early cables. Look at the insulation requirements and the signal attenuation challenges that weren't solved by modern physics until the mid-20th century. What if the cables were already there? What if the laying of the cable was merely a recovery mission? The engineers of the reset were scavengers. They were reconnecting the severed nerves of a global organism. They found the deep-sea conduits that once linked the star forts of Western Europe to the power stations of the Americas. They didn't invent the network. They hot-wired it. They tapped into a pre-existing frequency and called it innovation. This is the pattern of our entire technological age. We are told we are ascending a ladder, but we are actually just crawling through the ventilation shafts of a much larger, much older structure. The transition from atmospheric energy to wired electricity wasn't a breakthrough. It was an enclosure. It was a way to put a meter on the sun. The deeper I look into the archival records of the Patent Office, the more I see the fingerprints of the invisibles. These were the engineers who didn't take the credit. They operated through proxies. They sold their designs to General Electric, to Westinghouse, to Siemens, for pennies on the dollar, on the condition that their names never appeared in the history books. Why the anonymity? Because their designs were too efficient. They had to be downgraded for public consumption. You cannot have a consumer society if the consumer has access to a perpetual motion machine or a zero-point harvester. The engineers of the Tartarian diaspora were forced to introduce planned obsolescence into the very foundations of modern physics. They took the harmonic resonance of the old world and introduced friction. They introduced heat loss. They introduced the concept of scarcity into a world that was originally designed for abundance. Not this efficiency, not that output, something else, a controlled decline, a managed poverty of the soul. The somber reality of the modern industrial landscape is a direct result of this engineering of limits. We live in a world of near enough, built by men who knew the all. I found a series of photographs from the 1890s showing the interior of a powerhouse in a remote part of the Ural Mountains. The machines are not recognizable as steam engines or turbines. They are massive, obsidian-like blocks wrapped in silver filigree, vibrating so fast they appear blurred on the glass plate negative. There are no coal bunkers. There are no exhaust stacks. There are only men in white lab coats staring at the camera with eyes that look haunted. These are the engineers who stayed behind in the dead zones of the former Tartarian Empire. They were kept in secret laboratories, shielded from the public eye, tasked with maintaining the high-tech core of the New World's military apparatus. While the public was being sold the internal combustion engine, these men were refining the anti-gravitic properties of mercury redistribution. While we were being taught that space was a vacuum, they were learning how to sail the ether. The forbidden knowledge isn't a myth, it's a classified budget item. The institutional erasure is so complete that we don't even know what we're missing. We look at the stars and see distant balls of gas, because that's what the engineers told the astronomers to tell us. But what if the stars are part of the grid? What if the dome of the sky is as engineered as the dome of a cathedral? Think about the Great Depression. We are told it was a failure of the banking system, a collapse of credit and confidence. But look at the physical reality of the 1930s. Across the globe, massive infrastructure projects were undertaken. Dams, bridges, tunnels. These were the public works. In reality, they were the final sealing operations. They used the economic crisis as a cover to mobilize millions of desperate men to bury the last remnants of the old energy grid. They poured millions of tons of concrete over the resonance chambers. They flooded the valleys that contained the ancient star cities. They tamed the rivers that were once the arteries of the etheric flow. The Hoover Dam isn't just a hydroelectric plant, it's a plug. It's a massive weight designed to suppress the natural frequency of the Colorado River Basin. The engineers of the reset knew that as long as the old grid was accessible, their control was fragile. They had to weigh the earth down. They had to drown the evidence. And we cheered for it because they gave us a paycheck and a bowl of soup in return for our complicity in our own incarceration. The language of the engineers is a staccato of can't and won't. You can't travel faster than light. You won't find a way to create energy from nothing. You can't understand the origins of the megaliths. This is the rhythmic chanting of the gatekeepers. It is a pseudo-academic shell meant to discourage the inquisitive mind. But if you look at the load distribution of the Great Pyramid or the cathedral at Chartres, you see a technical language that speaks of can and will. You see a mastery of acoustics that could turn a stone room into a healing chamber or a communication hub. The modern engineer is a specialist in the how, but he has been forbidden from asking the why. He is a cog in a machine that is designed to keep the lights on, just enough so we can see to work, but not enough so we can see the chains. The urban exploration movement is, at its heart, a desperate attempt to reconnect with that why. We climb into the abandoned subway tunnels and the crumbling mental asylums because we can feel the ghost of the old power. We can feel the resonance in the brickwork. We are looking for the something else that the history books forgot to mention. I interviewed a retired sanitation engineer who worked in the deep tunnels beneath London in the 1970s. He told me about Section 14. It was a series of tunnels that weren't on any map, lined with a white ceramic-like material that stayed warm to the touch regardless of the season. He said the air there smelled like ozone and old books. He said the tunnels didn't lead to the sewer or the tube, they led down, deep down. He was told it was a Cold War bunker, but he noticed that the carvings on the archways were identical to the ones he had seen in photos of ancient Hindu temples. Not a bunker, not a tunnel, something else, a remnant of the world before the mud. He was given a generous pension and a non-disclosure agreement that made his hands shake when he signed it. This is how the institutional erasure persists. It isn't just through books. It's through the quiet silencing of the witnesses. It's through the generosity of the state. They buy your silence so they don't have to bury you. But the ceramic walls are still there. The ozone still lingers. The grid is waiting to be turned back on. What if the reset was not a single moment of destruction, but a gradual phasing out of reality? The engineers of Tartaria were masters of frequency. They understood that the physical world is just a vibration. What if they didn't die or hide, but were shifted? What if the cities we walk through today are just the low-frequency shadows of the original structures? This would explain why the old world buildings feel so much more solid and alive than the glass and steel boxes we build today. Our modern structures are out of phase with the earth. They are dissonant. They are designed to decay. The old buildings were designed to endure forever because they were in harmony with the global heartbeat. The engineers of the reset broke that harmony. They introduced the staccato of modern life, the jagged, nervous energy of the electric grid to keep us in a state of constant low-level anxiety. A tense population is an obedient population. A somber population is a productive population. They have engineered our very moods through the buildings we inhabit and the light we consume. Ask yourself why the modernist movement in architecture, which stripped away all ornament and beauty, was so aggressively pushed by the institutional gatekeepers after the world wars. They told us it was about form following function, but the function was psychological erasure. They wanted to remove the keys, the ornate carvings, the fractals, the statues of the gods. These weren't just decorations. They were mnemonic devices. They were instructions. They were the user manual for the old world's technology. By replacing them with flat, grey surfaces and sharp angles, the engineers ensured that the next generation would have nothing to trigger their memory. We were moved into concrete boxes and told it was progress. We were told that less is more, but less is just less. Less beauty, less memory, less power. The urban landscape became a desert of the mind, designed to make us forget that we were once the masters of the lightning. The final part of the engineer's plan is the unresolved loop. They leave just enough evidence to drive us mad, but not enough to set us free. They want us to stay in this state of perpetual investigation, chasing shadows in the steam tunnels and whispering about Tartaria on the fringes of the internet. As long as the knowledge is conspiratorial, it is not political. As long as it is mysterious, it is not actionable. They have turned the truth into a hobby. They have turned our heritage into a ghost story. But as I sit here, looking at the brass valve and the maps that shouldn't exist, I realise that the loop is only open because we refuse to close it. The engineers of the reset are still among us, designing the next white city, the next global fair, the next economic reset. They are waiting for us to stop asking what if and start asking when. When do we stop being the viewers of the documentary and start being the architects of the return? The silence of the history books is not a void, it is a scream. And it is time we started listening. The pattern is global, it is ancient, it is ongoing. From the buried windows of Prague to the temporary palaces of the St. Louis World's Fair, the evidence of a unified high-technology civilization is staring us in the face. We have been trained to look away. We have been educated to ignore the impossible. We have been told that our ancestors were grunting savages who somehow accidentally built the Taj Mahal and the Great Wall. But the engineers know the truth. They are the ones who turned the energy of the heavens into the utility bill. They are the ones who turned the sovereignty of the soul into the national identity. They are the ones who are even now preparing the next layer of mud. Ask yourself, if the history you were taught is a lie, what else are they hiding? If the ground beneath your feet is a roof, what is in the basement? And most importantly, who is holding the key? The investigation doesn't end here. It begins the moment you stop believing the labels. It begins the moment you realise that the way it reset didn't happen to them. It is happening to you, right now. In the silence between the sentences, in the flicker of the screen, in the cold weight of a brass valve that connects to nothing or everything. The silence of the census records in the mid-19th century is not a matter of administrative incompetence. It is a mathematical void. I have spent years cross-referencing the mortality rates of the 1840s with the sudden explosive population surges of the 1870s. The numbers do not calculate. You cannot have a global cataclysm, a mud flood that buries the first floors of every major capital, and then somehow emerge with a tripled labour force ready to pave the world in iron. Not this growth, not that migration, something else. The engineers of the reset were not just masters of stone and frequency, they were masters of the human biological clock. Ask yourself where the orphan trains truly came from. We are told they were the children of the destitute in New York and London, sent west to find homes. But tens of thousands of children, year after year, moved in sanitized boxcars to populate the newly discovered territories. It is a logistical impossibility for a pre-industrial society. Unless those children weren't orphans of poverty, what if they were the repopulators? What if they were the blank slates upon which the new history was written? The institutional gatekeepers needed a generation that had no memory of the etheric grid, no memory of the Tartarian heights, no memory of the world before the mud. They needed children. They needed the foundling as the foundation of the modern state. I found a ledger in the basement of a decommissioned asylum in rural Illinois, a building that featured the telltale buried windows and an oversized copper rotunda. The ledger didn't list patients, it listed batch numbers. It recorded the arrival of shipments of biological assets from 1852 to 1865. The handwriting is staccato, clinical, devoid of empathy. It describes the conditioning of these assets to accept the steam engine as the pinnacle of power and the coal fire as the source of heat. These were the engineers' apprentices, raised in the ruins of their own ancestors' palaces, taught to believe they were the first to walk the halls. They were told the star forts were for defence against savages who somehow possessed the tactical knowledge to threaten granite bastions. They were told the great cathedrals were built by pious peasants who spent centuries hauling stone for a god they couldn't see. The institutional erasure was a two-pronged attack. They buried the technology in the earth, and they buried the truth in the minds of the young. The school system, as we know it, the bells, the rows, the rote memorization of dates, was the final engineering project of the reset. It was designed to produce a workforce that could operate the machines, but would never ask who built the factory. Think about the great fires that leveled the downtown districts of nearly every American city between 1850 and 1910. Seattle, Boston, Toronto, Baltimore, San Francisco. We are told it was the price of progress, but look at the photographs of the aftermath. You see brick buildings turned to fine dust. You see iron lampposts melted into puddles. You see the stone foundations of the old world stand defiant while the new timber additions are vanished. These weren't accidents. They were clearing operations. The engineers realized that the architectural evidence of the Tartarian era was too pervasive. They couldn't bury everything. So they burned what they could. They used thermal accelerants that we are told didn't exist until the mid-20th century to liquefy the evidence of the old grid. And then before the ashes were cold, they passed the building codes. They ensured that the new structures would be made of inferior materials, with limited lifespans, disconnected from the Earth's natural resonance. They turned the city into a fire trap, so they could justify the safety of the cage. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings in your city are always the ones that luckily survived the fire. Or were they spared because they were the nodes the engineers still needed? The trail leads to the great expositions again, but this time look at the demolition. I found a grainy film strip from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. It shows the palace of agriculture being brought down not with wrecking balls, but with controlled implosions that look eerily similar to modern demolition techniques. The staff material they claim the buildings were made of, a mixture of plaster and hemp, explodes with a density that suggests heavy masonry. Why the rush to destroy? Because the fairs were the last time the atmospheric energy collectors were allowed to be seen in public. Once the lesson of the fair was over, once the public had been sufficiently dazzled by the new electric light, the evidence had to be vaporized. The engineers couldn't risk a stray tinkerer taking a closer look at the decorations on the roof. Those decorations were antennae. Those lagoons were cooling ponds for the underground reactors. The fairs were the transition phase where the old power was laundered into the new utility companies. They didn't dismantle the palaces because they were temporary. They dismantled them because they were dangerous to the monopoly of the emerging elite. The language of the reset is a language of standardization. Everything had to be measured, taxed, and timed. The engineers of the Tartarian era worked with the organic frequency of the earth. Their measurements were based on the proportions of the human body and the harmonics of the planet. The new engineers introduced the metric and the standard as a way to sever that connection. They created a world of rectilinear thinking. Not this flow, not that harmony. Something else, a rigid, artificial grid that mirrors the wires they strung across the sky. The institutional gatekeeping of the scientific community ensures that any research into scalar waves or etheric density is met with ridicule. It is the rhythmic drumming of the skeptic meant to drown out the hum of the universe, but the hum is still there. You can hear it in the silence of the desert. You can feel it in the stones of the star forts. The standardized world is a thin veneer, a wallpaper of lies stretched over a masterpiece of engineering. I spoke with an urban surveyor in San Francisco who was tasked with mapping the old sea walls. He found that the stones at the base of the wall were not local. They were a type of basalt found only in the mountains of Central Asia. He found that the stones were joined with a geopolymer that was harder than the rock itself, a material that modern chemistry claims was only perfected in the 1980s. When he submitted his report, the project was defunded within 48 hours. His files were seized. He was told there was a clerical error and his services were no longer required. This is how the invisibles operate. They don't just hide the evidence, they hide the people who find it. They create a professional environment where asking the wrong question is a career-ending move. The engineers of the reset are the ones who sign the paychecks. They are the ones who define the scope of work, and they have ensured that the scope never includes the truth. The somber reality is that we are living in a post-reclamation world. We are the squatters in a palace we no longer understand. We look at the Roman aqueducts and the Gothic cathedrals and we see art. We should be seeing infrastructure. We should be seeing a global communication and energy network that was decapitated and left to rot. The Renaissance was not a rebirth of learning. It was a looting of the ruins. The Industrial Revolution was not a leap forward. It was the final boxing of the free energy that remained. The engineers who stayed in the shadows have spent the last 200 years managing the decline. They have given us just enough gadgetry to keep us distracted, while they maintain the real technology in the deep places, not for the benefit of humanity, not for the preservation of life, for the maintenance of the reset. Ask yourself why every global crisis, crisis, seems to result in the destruction of cultural heritage. The library at Sarajevo, the museums in Baghdad, the renovations of the Vatican. It is a continuous cleaning of the archives. They are removing the last hard copies of the old world. They are moving us into a digital reality where history can be edited in real time, where Tartaria can be turned into a conspiracy theory with a single update to the algorithm. The engineers are building a virtual star fort, a digital enclosure that will be even more effective than the mud. In this new reset, we won't even have the buried windows to remind us. We will have only the feed. We will have only the official narrative delivered directly to our retinas. This is the final load distribution, the total weight of the lie balanced perfectly on the shoulders of a population that has forgotten how to look down. I found a map from 1812 in a private collection in London. It shows a series of lighthouses along the coast of Africa that are labelled as etheric beacons. These beacons weren't for ships, they were for aerial navigation. The map shows flight paths that connect the star forts of Europe to the lost cities of the Amazon. It shows a world that was unified, mobile, and vibrant. And then the red ink stops. The next map in the series, dated 1845, shows a dark continent. It shows unexplored territories where the beacons used to be. It shows barbarian tribes living in the ruins of the power stations. The transition was total. The explorers of the Victorian era weren't discovering new lands. They were surveying the damage. They were the claims adjusters for the engineers of the reset. They were deciding which parts of the old world could be refurbished and which had to be erased. What if the unresolved loop is the only thing keeping us human? The engineers want a closed system. They want a world where every why has a standardized answer. But the anomalies persist. The brass valve on my desk, the buried windows in Chicago, the impossible maps. These are the glitches in the reset. They are the philosophical open loops that refuse to be closed. As long as one person asks, what if, the system is not total. As long as one person looks at a monument and sees a machine, the engineers have failed. The inquisitive, skeptical mind is the only weapon we have against the institutional gatekeepers. We must become the re-engineers of our own history. We must learn to read the stone and the light. We must learn to hear the frequency beneath the noise. The investigation is not a search for facts. It is a battle for reality. The somber, tense atmosphere of our modern cities is not an accident. It is the emotional tone of a conquered people. We feel the weight of the forbidden knowledge, even if we can't name it. We feel the somber resonance of the buildings that were designed to be our masters. But we can also feel the tension of the truth trying to break through. The investigative essayist is not a reporter. He is a deprogrammer. He is a person who looks at the staccato of the official story and finds the rhythm of the lie. He is the person who invites you to investigate alongside him, not to find answers, but to find sight. Ask yourself, what do you see when you look at the skyline? Do you see progress, or do you see the tombstones of a giant? The final reset is coming, and the engineers are ready. They have the smart cities mapped out. They have the digital currency ready to replace the debt. They have the narrative polished to a mirror finish. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that the mud eventually dries. They forgot that the buried windows still look out. They forgot that the brass valve still feels cold in the hand. The evidence of the world before is not just in the archives, it is in our DNA. We are the heritage they couldn't erase. We are the engineers of the future. If only we can remember the past. The loop is open. The investigation is live. What if you are the anomaly the system can't handle? What if you are the frequency that breaks the grid? The institutional erasure of Tartaria is the greatest heist in human history. They didn't just steal our gold, they stole our potential. They turned us from creators into consumers. They turned our sovereignty into citizenship. But the staccato sentencing of the modern age is starting to falter. People are starting to rhythmicize their own lives. They are starting to build outside the grid. They are starting to reclaim the ruins. The engineers in the shadows are nervous. They can feel the load distribution shifting. They can feel the resonance rising. The skeptical mind is the grounding wire for the truth. And once the truth is grounded, the lightning returns. Look at the load distribution of your own life. How much of what you believe is standardized? How much of your history is just a series of reset points? The engineers have built a world that is technically accurate but spiritually void. They have given us the technical terms to describe our own imprisonment, but they can't stop the urban exploration of the soul. They can't stop the investigative spirit that seeks the something else. The revisionist geek documentary of our existence is being written every day, in every basement with a buried window, in every attic with a forbidden book. The gatekeepers are just men, and men can be bypassed. The somber tone of this narrative is not a sign of defeat. It is a sign of reverence. We are walking through a graveyard of giants, and it is only right that we speak in whispers. But even in a graveyard, there is life. Even in the silence of the erasure, there is a signal. The engineers of the reset have done their best to mute the world, but they forgot that silence is just another frequency. And if you listen long enough, the silence starts to speak. It speaks of the Tartarian heights. It speaks of the etheric flow. It speaks of the engineers who refuse to hide. It speaks of you. What if the reset was a choice? What if the engineers didn't fall but stepped aside? What if they are waiting for us to prove that we are worthy of the power? What if the mud was a test to see if we would dig? The unresolved philosophical open loop is the ultimate challenge. Do we wait for the next reset, or do we close the circuit ourselves? The investigation is conspiratorial because the truth is a conspiracy against the lie. The staccato sentences are the heartbeat of the resistance. Not this world, not that world, our world, reclaimed. I will leave you with this. The brass valve on my desk has started to vibrate. It isn't the passing of a truck. It isn't the wind. It is a sympathetic resonance with something beneath the floorboards. Something old, something engineered, something patient. The gatekeepers can lock the doors, but they can't stop the foundation from humming. The investigation is no longer external. It is vibrational. Ask yourself, can you feel it? What if the reset is unresetting? What if the mud is melting? What if the engineers are returning? The somber world is about to get very bright. The erasure is a shroud, and shrouds are made to be lifted. The institutional power is a wall, and walls are made to be scaled. The historical mystery is a puzzle, and puzzles are made to be solved. The engineers of Tartaria didn't go anywhere. They are in the geometry of our cells. They are in the frequency of our breath. They are in the potential of our mind. The reset was just a pause. The play button is within reach. All you have to do is push. As the narrator of this investigation, I have shown you the cracks. I have shown you the shadows. I have shown you the impossible, but I cannot show you the truth. The truth is not a fact you learn. It is a resonance you become. The engineers of the reset are banking on your disbelief. They are counting on your for fear. They are relying on your athi. But they underestimated your curiosity. They underestimated your spirit. They underestimated us. The documentary is over. The investigation is eternal. Wait for the next frequency. Listen for the next rhythm. Watch for the next anomaly. The world is not what they told you. It is something else. And you are the only one who can find it. The loop remains open. The investigator remains active. The mystery remains alive. Ask yourself, what if? And then go see. The mud is waiting. The windows are watching. The truth is humming. Not this, not that. Everything. The staccato rhythm of our modern reality is a distraction from the deep tectonic shifts occurring beneath the surface. I have been tracing the migration of the master masons, those specific lineages of stonecutters and frequency shapers who appeared in the wake of the 1850 resets. They were not wandering labourers, they were a mobile strike force of architectural erasure. Not this union, not that guild, something else. They were the adjusters. I found a collection of unsorted manifests from the port of New Orleans, dated 1856, listing hundreds of men arriving from the Crimea just as the war there was concluding. These men didn't bring luggage. They brought specialised instruments, theodolites that looked more like telescopes, and heavy lead-lined trunks that the dock workers refused to touch. Within 3 years, the skyline of New Orleans began to transform. The sunken appearance of the French Quarter was codified into law as a drainage necessity, while the adjusters began installing the massive, ornate ironwork that characterises the city. Ask yourself, why does decorative ironwork in a humid, salt air environment consist of complex fractal patterns that mirror the waveguides of modern microwave technology? What if the iron wasn't there to keep people out, but to keep a specific atmospheric resonance in? The institutional gatekeeping of the architectural record is a masterpiece of sombre misdirection. They tell us that the old world style was simply a matter of aesthetic preference, a nostalgic look back at a classical era that never truly existed as described. But look at the low distribution of the post-reset courthouses. They are built with a structural redundancy that makes no sense for a society supposedly struggling with the costs of basic infrastructure, unless the redundancy wasn't for weight but for storage. I have spent weeks in the sub-basements of municipal buildings across the Midwest, and I have found the same anomaly in every one: a central pillar of high-density quartz-rich granite that extends far below the official foundation. These pillars are etched with the same geometric precision as the brass valve on my desk. They are the ground rods for the old grid. The engineers who went into the shadow of the state didn't just build offices, they built capacitors. They were preserving the hardware of Tartaria, while the software, the knowledge of how to use it, was being deleted from the public mind. Not this history, not that history. Something else. A history of hidden function masquerading as civic pride. Consider the Great Reset of the electrical standards in the late 1880s. The war of the currents between Edison and Tesla was not a competition of brilliance. It was a managed theatrical performance. The engineers of the reset had already decided the outcome. They couldn't allow Tesla's vision of free, wireless atmospheric energy to prevail, because it was the last vestige of the Tartarian system. It was too decentralized. It was too liberating. They needed a system that could be metered, taxed, and cut off. They chose the wired world, not because it was better, but because it was a leash. Ask yourself why Tesla's most advanced laboratory in Wardenclyffe was demolished by the government under the guise of national security during a time of peace. They weren't afraid of spies. They were afraid of the resonance. They were afraid that the engineers who hadn't been turned would find a way to reactivate the star forts. The institutional erasure of Tesla's true work is the blueprint for how they handle any rogue engineering today. They don't just stop the invention, they destroy the inventor's place in time. The somber, tense atmosphere of our modern institutions is a byproduct of the dead energy they inhabit. When you walk into a post-reset post office or a state treasury, you feel a peculiar weight, a pressure behind the eyes. This is the effect of a suppressed frequency. The engineers designed these buildings to act as sinks for the human spirit. They took the uplifting harmonic geometry of the old world and inverted it. They used the same load distribution principles to crush their psyche instead of elevating it. Not this architecture, not that design, something else. An engineering of despair. They replaced the living stone of the Tartarian era with dead concrete and synthetic polymers that block the Earth's natural magnetism. We are living in a giant Faraday cage, and we call it urbanization. The gatekeepers know that a population disconnected from the planet's resonance is a population that can be easily manipulated by artificial signals. I found a series of letters from a surveying assistant who worked on the construction of the London Underground in the 1860s. He describes encountering pre-existing vaults of polished obsidian that the chief engineer insisted were natural volcanic formations in London, one of the most geologically stable basins in Europe. He writes of the men being forced to work in shifts, not because of the labour, but because the humming from the obsidian made them nauseous and gave them visions of cities of light. These vaults were part of the subterranean Tartarian transit system, a network of vacuum tubes that spanned the globe. The modern underground is just a crude steam and soot patch job laid over a much more elegant machine. The engineers of the reset didn't build the tunnels, they retrofitted them, and they buried the obsidian beneath layers of brick and modern tiles to ensure the passengers would never feel the hum. The pattern of erasure extends to the very soil beneath our feet. I have been investigating the landscaping projects of the late 1800s, the creation of the great city parks like Central Park in New York or the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. These weren't just green lungs for the city, they were massive burial mounds for the ruins that couldn't be burned. When they cleared the slums of the old world, they didn't haul the debris away. They piled it up, covered it with a few feet of topsoil, and called it a rolling meadow. If you dig more than 6 feet down in any major urban park, you won't find prehistoric clay. You will find the shattered remains of marble columns and tempered glass. The engineers were mounding the evidence, turning the cathedrals of the past into the playgrounds of the present. Ask yourself why the most prominent hills in otherwise flat cities are almost always artificial. What are they hiding? What is the load distribution of a park built on a palace? Think about the transcontinental railroads. We are shown pictures of men with sledgehammers driving golden spikes into the desert. But look at the topographical maps of the routes they chose. They are nearly identical to the ancient spirit lines mapped by indigenous cultures and the energy conduits of the Tartarian engineers. The railroads didn't open up the wilderness, they followed the pre-existing grid of the star forts. They used the railroad as a physical shunt, a way to ground the energy of the ley lines into the steel tracks. The Vriggedishall robber barons who funded the railroads were the same men who funded the historical societies. They were securing the veins of the earth. The engineers of the reset knew that if you control the movement of iron over the earth's pressure points, you control the vibration of the territory. Not this commerce, not that transport, something else. A continental scale circuit board. The language of the investigator is one of skepticism, but the language of the engineer is one of limits. I once attended a lecture by a prominent structural historian who spent an hour explaining why it was physically impossible for the ancient world to have used atmospheric energy. He used technical terms like dielectric breakdown and potential gradient to baffle the audience. But when I asked him about the copper-gilded lightning rods on the roofs of 17th century cathedrals that were 20 times larger than necessary for a simple strike, he went silent. The somber, intellectually provocative truth is that they know. They have the manuals. They have the forbidden knowledge locked in the vaults of the technical universities. They teach the limits so that the next generation of engineers will never even think to look for the possibilities. This is the institutional erasure at its most refined. Not the burning of books, but the narrowing of the imagination. As I look at the LiDAR scans of the Amazon rainforest, the unresolved loop becomes a global crisis. We see the outlines of massive geometric cities, star forts hidden beneath the canopy, identical in layout to the ones in Europe and Asia. This was a unified Earth. There were no unexplored regions before the reset. There were only zones of the global grid. The explorers, like Colonel Fawcett, weren't looking for lost tribes. They were looking for the primary switches. They were looking for the places where the energy of the earth was still live. And many of them, like Fawcett, simply vanished. Did they die? Or did they find the engineers who never left? What if there are still pockets of the old world operating in the deep places, shielded from our reset reality by the very technology they invented? The tense, mysterious nature of this investigation is not because the evidence is scarce, but because the evidence is everywhere. It is so pervasive that we have become blind to it. We see a domed Capitol and think government. We see a star fort and think war. We see a buried window and think basement. We have been conditioned to accept the labels instead of the functions, but the brass valve doesn't care about labels. The quartz pillars don't care about building codes. The earth doesn't care about the census records. The reset is a thin, fragile layer of now stretched over an eternal then. And the layer is starting to tear. The skeptical mind is the needle that finds the tear. And once you see the something else beneath the fabric, you can never go back to being a citizen of the lie. You become a navigator of the truth. Would you like me to continue with the next 5 parts of the script to complete the 10-part investigative narrative?